In the BONE.2 standard, we'll be discussing the two primary ways that bones develop. Then we'll also take a look at if there is damage done to a bone, what are the steps that we can utilize to repair that bone and get it back to its original shape and form. Your standard for BONE.2 reads, I can explain the processes of bone growth, development, and repair. And we're still in section 7.1 of your textbook. You'll see there's not a lot of terms listed down below, but I promise you the processes involved are pretty dense, and that's why I tried to keep this standard down to those two things. You'll see intermembranous and endochondral. Those are the main types of bones we'll be talking about. This first slide is a repeat. We're just reminding ourselves that the skeletal system is not just bone, but it's cartilage, it's blood, it's nervous tissue, and that there are four primary functions: support, protection, attaching our muscles, making our blood, and storing our salts. Your first new title for today is Bone Development and Growth, and the first kind we are going to look at is intramembranous ossification. So there's that prefix os again. Osseous tissue meant bone. Osteocyte was a bone cell. Ossification is the process of building bone. To break that other word down, intramembranous, intra means between, and then membrane. So we're building bones in between membranes. And that's exactly what this definition says. It says new bones are formed between sheets of primitive connective tissue. And you can kind of already predict what kind of bones are intramembranous. If we have two pieces of paper and we start building bone in between those two pieces of paper, we are going to be pressed in between those two sheets, and it's going to form a broad, flat surface. So if you guess that this is forming a flat bone, you're absolutely correct. Our skull, our sternum, our scapula, which is our shoulder blade, any of these bones are formed this way in utero. The first step in intramembranous ossification is that we have stem cells. Stem cells are capable of differentiating and forming different cell types. And so what they do is they start to form osteoblasts. And osteoblasts, that B stands for bone building. So these are cells that are capable of pushing out calcium, pushing out that bone matrix, and physically constructing a bone. They continue to do that. They build bone matrix all around themselves to build up the bone. And then eventually they've done that so well that they're surrounded by bone structure. So here is our little ossification center. The osteoblast is building bone. You can see these three have been building for a while and they're completely surrounded. And you'll also notice that once they've done that, they're no longer osteoblasts. When they're completely surrounded, they are then osteocytes. Just functional living bone cells sitting in their own lacuna, that little carved out region, capable of acting as a mature bone cell. As that continues to happen throughout the flat bone, we'll see these branching trabeculae, we'll see the spaces in between the spongy bone, and then eventually towards the outside, we'll build layers of compact bone, which will finish out our flat bone shape. So that is the first process, sitting in between two sheets and building flat bone. The other type of ossification is endochondral, and this is how we create most of our long bones and perhaps our irregular and short as well. These bones first exist in the embryo as a hyaline cartilage model. So before any bones are built, the embryo contains little miniature versions of those bones made completely out of cartilage. Once those embryos have reached a certain stage of development, that cartilage will begin to be replaced by our bone building cells, which were osteoblasts. There's going to be two ossification centers here, two places where we build bone. The first one, the primary ossification center, is going to start in the center of the long bone, in the diaphysis. And so that's where we'll begin building bone. We'll still have mostly, if not completely, cartilage in the two epiphyses. But as time goes on, we'll develop secondary ossification centers in both the proximal and distal epiphyses, capable of building bone down at the ends as well. These two regions are going to continue to grow towards one another. So out of the diaphysis, out of the epiphysis, and you'll notice they meet at these lines right here. These epiphyseal plates are your growth plates, and they don't seal when you're born. They don't seal in childhood. They wait until you're an adolescent, and you continue to grow right here at this region where the ossification centers meet. They continue to grow until eventually you reach your mature height, and then they seal up, and any sort of growth is ceased. You can't grow anymore. A very similar mechanism is employed here. So osteoblasts are building bone, and then when they're fully surrounded, they turn into osteocytes. And like I mentioned, those epiphyseal plates are your growth plates. Throughout your entire life, though, once your growth plates seal, you're not done. Your bones are constantly going through a process known as remodeling, where they're breaking themselves down and rebuilding themselves up so that it doesn't become this stale, old, brittle feature. It's continually new bone cells. There are two processes that kind of happen in balance here. Bone deposition is carried out by osteoblasts, so that just means building, but it's balanced by bone reabsorption, and that's done by a cell called an osteoclast. So an osteoclast removes bone. It secretes an enzyme to break it down. About 10 to 20% of your skeleton is consistently replaced each year as the osteoclasts eat it up, and then the osteoblasts reform it. And that happens over and over again. So about 7 years, you get a brand new skeleton. The last subheading for this standard is about fractures. So what do we do if we have broken a bone? There are two types of fractures. The first is called a simple fracture, and it's described as more of a closed fracture, so you can't see this broken bone. It has not broken the skin and allowed foreign bacteria and viruses and parasites into your body, so the break is protected. An open fracture, on the other hand, does break the skin, and so we have a much greater incidence of infection and a much bigger worry about the severity of the compound fracture. So what do we do? How do we heal it? First thing is we want to stop the bleeding. So we want to make what's called a hematoma, a big blood clot. And you have a lot of blood vessels that are running through your bones, so this is going to be a very large, dark, crunchy blood clot. After that, just like when you were a skeleton, we're going to fix the bone with cartilage first. You can build cartilage a lot faster. So as the phagocytes go in there and remove the cartilage, remove the debris, you have cells just like osteoblasts, but they're capable of building cartilage instead. So you build a cartilage callus. Over time, eventually, you'll replace that cartilage callus with a bony callus, and that's, of course, done by our bone-building cells, the osteoblasts. So they'll go in, they'll fill in that solid bone matrix, and they'll kind of overdo it a little bit. You'll see it won't be a nice, clean shape, much like a scar on your skin. This bone will have a bulge to it where it was broken. And then lastly, maybe we'll send in some osteoclasts to try to shave it down and get it to as similar a shape and consistency as it was before it was broken. And that's how you heal the bone.